The day Henry VIII's flesh began to rot, so too did the empire he built. The towering, charismatic monarch who broke with Rome and reshaped England with an iron will died not with a bang, but with a whimper, a grotesque shadow of his former self, ravaged by infection, fear, and madness. This isn't the romanticized history you learned in school. This is the grim unmasking of a man whose kingdom, and very body, decayed under the weight of his own sins. Let's cast our minds back to the beginning. When Henry VIII ascended to the throne in 1509, he was the very embodiment of a Renaissance prince. 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered, exceptionally handsome, and fiercely intelligent, he was celebrated across Europe as a true golden boy, a man who possessed every virtue expected of a monarch. A skilled musician who composed his own tunes, a keen theologian deeply involved in scholarly debate, and an athlete who excelled at tennis, jousting, and hunting. He seemed destined for nothing short of epoch-making greatness. He was everything a king should be: strong, virile, charming, and brimming with an almost infectious zest for life, promising a glorious new chapter for England. His early reign was marked by dynamism and ambition that captivated his court and beyond. He commissioned grand projects like Hampton Court, engaged in impressive military campaigns against France, and charmed foreign dignitaries with an effortless charisma that made him the envy of other European monarchs. He wasn't just king by birthright. He looked the part, moving with an imposing stride and commanding attention with every word. The portrait painted by Hans Holbein, the Younger, capturing his formidable, almost defiant presence, is the iconic image most people carry in their minds. A powerful, confident ruler, master of his domain, and seemingly his own unyielding destiny. But here's the uncomfortable truth, the shadow beneath the splendor. That golden image would eventually shatter, replaced by a grotesque shadow of his former self. The very qualities that had defined his youth, that relentless pursuit of physical prowess and boundless indulgence, would ironically become the instruments of his slow, agonizing downfall. The jousting tournaments he loved so dearly, pushing his body to its limits, the elaborate feasts he devoured with legendary gusto, piling rich meats and sweet wines onto his plate, and the intoxicating absolute power he wielded without question, each contributed to a gradual, insidious transformation. It turned a vibrant, celebrated king into a sickly, increasingly corpulent, and dangerously tyrannical mess. His court, initially a dazzling hub of intellectual and cultural activity, where scholars debated and artists flourished, slowly morphed into a suffocating hotbed of fear and intrigue. The youthful, approachable king, once admired for his wit and generosity, gradually became a figure to be profoundly feared, his volatile temper growing more unpredictable and explosive with each passing year. The jovial monarch who could once command respect through his sheer presence now demanded absolute obedience through raw terror, creating an atmosphere where a single, innocent misstep, a poorly chosen word, a perceived slight, even a momentary glance, could swiftly lead to imprisonment, ruin, or the chilling finality of the chopping block. This drastic shift wasn't merely a change in personality, a natural mellowing with age. It was a profound physical and psychological disintegration that carried devastating implications for England and its people. The vibrant, athletic king of the 1510s and 20s, full of promise and vigor, bore almost no resemblance to the increasingly monstrous, swollen figure of the 1540s. His body, once a temple of strength, was becoming a source of constant torment, and his mind, once sharp, grew clouded with paranoia. Understanding this profound decay isn't just about chronicling A King's Personal Decline. It's about revealing how a single man's creeping physical suffering and unraveling psyche can fundamentally warp the destiny of an entire nation. The leg that changed history. An injury's corrosive legacy. Let's talk about the specific incident that many historians believe marked the beginning of Henry's true downfall. A catastrophic jousting accident of January 15, 36. He was 44, still relatively active, but his body already showed the strain of indulgence and exertion. Famously fearless, Henry often pushed the limits of the sport with heavier armor and larger lances. During this particular tournament at Greenwich, his fully armored horse fell on him, pinning him beneath its crushing weight. He was knocked unconscious for an astounding 2 hours. His courtiers, and Anne Boleyn herself, rushed to his side, fearing the king was dead. This was no ordinary bump. It was a severe head injury that profoundly contributed to cognitive and emotional changes his courtiers observed. Modern medical consensus suggests this blunt force trauma caused permanent brain damage, exacerbating his volatile temperament, leading to impaired judgment, memory issues, and personality shifts utterly transforming his reign. But even more devastating and visibly horrifying was the injury to his left leg. For years, Henry had suffered from a recurring ulcer on that leg, a festering wound, possibly from a previous jousting mishap or deep vein thrombosis, worsened by his rich diet. This new trauma didn't just reopen the old wound, it tore it apart. The fall ripped open the ulcer, turning it into a chronic, unhealing sore, plaguing him for his remaining 11 years. This wasn't just a minor discomfort. It was a gaping, oozing, inflamed, infected chasm in his flesh. Imagine the constant throbbing, relentless pain, a torment that never truly receded, gnawing at him constantly. Think about the putrid stench of infection that filled his royal chambers, clinging to his clothing and bedding, an inescapable reminder of his bodily corruption. Picture the agonizing efforts to move or stand, to simply shift his immense weight without tearing the wound further. This leg ulcer became a grotesque, physical manifestation of the corruption spreading within his body, and, arguably, his increasingly tyrannical reign, a constant, visible reminder of his decaying golden image. The medical understanding of the time was rudimentary at best, a tragic irony for a king with limitless resources. Physicians tried a bewildering array of treatments: foul-smelling poultices, salves, even brutal cauterization, burning the flesh with red-hot irons in desperate attempts to cleanse and close it. But nothing worked. The wound would temporarily scab over, offering a fleeting moment of relief, only to break open again, violently bursting open with pus and blood. This chronic infection subjected Henry to constant fever, debilitating weakness, and an unrelenting agony no royal power, plea, or command could alleviate. It was a king's ultimate powerlessness in the face of his own physical decline. Beyond the sheer physical pain, the leg injury led to a drastic reduction in his activity. The vibrant, athletic king who once hunted, jousted, and danced was now confined to his chambers, unable to engage in the strenuous sports that had defined his very identity. This forced inactivity, combined with his gargantuan appetite, which only intensified with comfort eating, led to rapid and extreme weight gain. The dashing, virile figure of his youth morphed into a grotesquely obese man, rumored to have a 54-inch waist in his final years, a stark, shocking contrast to the golden boy of his ascension. The constant pain and physical limitations didn't just frustrate him. They fueled his formidable temper, turning it into a monstrous, unpredictable force. His boisterous laugh became a terrifying roar. His quick wit morphed into biting sarcasm. The ceaseless physical discomfort made him acutely irritable, profoundly impatient, and terrifyingly impulsive. Courtiers walked on eggshells, knowing a king in constant agony was prone to sudden, violent, irreversible decisions. This single festering wound, more than any other factor, fundamentally altered the trajectory of Henry's life and, by chilling extension, England's destiny. The physical decay became a mirror for the moral and political rot. The relentless physical decay had a profound and terrifying impact on Henry VIII's mental state. Imagine living in constant, agonizing pain for over a decade. The kind of pain that never fully recedes, that wakes you from sleep, that makes every movement a struggle. Such an existence would break anyone, but in a king with absolute power, it fostered a dangerous cocktail of paranoia, rage, and intellectual deterioration. This wasn't just a physical decline. It was the slow, agonizing erosion of the very man England had once adored. The witty, charming, athletic prince was literally rotting from the inside out, and that internal corruption mirrored itself in a mind increasingly untethered from its former brilliance and moral compass. Medical historians have long debated the exact nature of Henry's various ailments, but the symptoms are clear. Beyond the chronic leg ulcer and obesity, he likely suffered from a combination of conditions, each exacerbating the others. Some speculate about type 2 diabetes, a consequence of his rich diet and forced inactivity. This would not only have gravely worsened his leg infection, turning the wound into an almost impossible-to-heal affliction, but also contributed to constant thirst, frequent urination, and general malaise, all of which would naturally fuel a king's legendary impatience. Others point to syphilis, a common, if often hushed, affliction among royalty in an era before effective treatment. The tertiary stage of syphilis could readily explain the severe mood swings, pronounced cognitive decline, and tragic stillbirths among his wives. Think about it. A potent sexually transmitted disease literally eating away at his brain, manifesting as delusions of grandeur, paranoia, and explosive, irrational fury. More recent theories suggest hypothyroidism, explaining the rapid and extreme weight gain, persistent lethargy, and a mental fogginess that would periodically shroud his once sharp intellect. Regardless of the precise diagnosis, or more likely, the devastating confluence of multiple untreated conditions, the combined effect was truly devastating. His short-term memory suffered noticeably, leaving courtiers repeating information and risking his wrath. His famous intelligence, once so sharp, so celebrated by scholars like Erasmus, became clouded and erratic, prone to sudden shifts and alarming lapses. Decisions that once took careful deliberation and the counsel of his brightest minds were now made on sudden violent whims, often contradicting earlier decrees, leaving his government in a state of bewildered paralysis. The paranoia, however, was perhaps the most frightening transformation. The king, once surrounded by trusted advisors, a man who loved hearty banter and intellectual debate, began to see enemies everywhere. Every whisper, every hushed conversation, every perceived slight was interpreted as an elaborate plot against his person or his crown. The Boleyn family, Thomas Cromwell, even close friends like the Duke of Norfolk, all were victims of his increasingly erratic suspicion, his terrifying certainty of their disloyalty. This wasn't merely shrewd political maneuvering to eliminate rivals. It was a psychological unraveling, a true descent into delusion, fueled by the relentless physical pain that made him feel constantly under attack and a mind no longer fully anchored in reality. Imagine the terror of his courtiers, knowing that their very survival depended on navigating the shifting currents of a king's fevered imagination, where a polite suggestion could be misconstrued as treason and lead to a swift, brutal end. The constant, unyielding pain from his leg and other ailments would have necessitated heavy doses of opium or other strong pain-relieving substances available at the time. These medications, while offering temporary, desperately needed respite, came with their own insidious side effects. They could profoundly contribute to mental confusion, deepen the existing lethargy, cause severe constipation, a debilitating issue for a man of his immense size, and further depress his already struggling physical state, creating a truly vicious cycle. The king was caught in a self-perpetuating nightmare of his own body's making, perpetually seeking relief that only led to further decline, leaving him irritable, disoriented, and increasingly tyrannical, and England was forced to endure it with him. His physicians walked a tightrope, knowing that easing his physical agony could worsen his mental state, while reducing the drugs would unleash an enraged, tormented monarch upon them. His interactions became notoriously volatile, swinging wildly between sullen withdrawal and explosive fury. Courtiers reported him flying into rages over trivial matters. A misplaced document, a poorly chosen word, a servant's innocent fumble, then lapsing into dark, brooding silence for days, making him utterly unapproachable. He was unpredictable, dangerous, a ticking time bomb of pain and power. The casual bonhomie and engaging wit of his youth, the very qualities that had endeared him to his court, were replaced by a chilling unpredictability that kept everyone around him in a state of perpetual terror. This environment of pervasive fear was not an accident. It was a direct, horrifying consequence of a king whose mind was slowly, agonizingly breaking under the unbearable weight of his own suffering and unchecked, absolute power. And it set the stage for even more ruthless decisions to come. As Henry VIII's health deteriorated, his obsession with securing the Tudor succession became even more intense, even more desperate. With his body failing him, literally rotting from the inside out, the king saw his physical form dissolving, making the idea of an enduring legacy through a legitimate male heir not just a political necessity, but a profound, almost spiritual quest for immortality. This desperate need to leave an undeniable mark on history, to defy his own encroaching oblivion, was precisely what drove many of his most brutal and infamous decisions in his later years, amplified by the paranoia and rage that now consumed his deteriorating mind. By the mid-1540s, his only male heir, Edward, was a sickly boy, born of a mother who died shortly after his birth, and quite possibly inheriting some of his father's less fortunate genes, leaving him frail and frequently ill. This added a terrifying urgency to Henry's fixation. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, had been declared illegitimate at various points throughout his tumultuous reign, their positions tenuous and constantly shifting, depending on the whims of Parliament and the king's latest theological pronouncements. The king was staring down the barrel of his own mortality, knowing that his death could plunge England back into the chaos of civil war if the succession wasn't rock solid. This fear was not unfounded. The brutal recent memory of the Wars of the Roses, a bloody conflict sparked by disputed succession, was still fresh in the collective English psyche, and Henry, more than anyone, understood the fragility of a crown without a clear lineage. The frantic search for a healthy heir, a perfect embodiment of his dynastic ambition, led to more wives, more annulments, and more executions. Think of poor Catherine Howard, his vivacious fifth queen, beheaded for adultery in 1542, her young life brutally cut short by a king whose paranoia saw betrayal in every whisper and whose physical pain made him intolerant of any perceived slight to his honor or his succession. Then there was Catherine Parr, his sixth and final wife, who, by sheer force of will and a healthy dose of political acumen, managed to survive him, but not without navigating the perilous waters of his unpredictable temper, his shifting affections, and his ever-present suspicions. Her role in those final years became as much nursemaid as queen, forced to manage his moods, his intellectual debates, and the truly festering wounds that now permeated his body, walking a tightrope between survival and the executioner's block. His paranoia about the succession extended far beyond his immediate family, encompassing anyone who might, however distantly, challenge it. The Poles, distant Plantagenet relatives with royal blood, were systematically eliminated, their very existence seen as a threat, a viable alternative that could unravel his carefully constructed Tudor dynasty. This wasn't merely shrewd political maneuvering. It was a psychological unraveling, a true descent into delusion, fueled by the relentless physical pain that made him feel constantly under attack. Any perceived disloyalty, any whisper of dissent, could be interpreted as an elaborate plot against his person or his crown, an attack on his carefully constructed future. The Tower of London became a busy, terrifying place in these final years, filled with courtiers, nobles, and even friends who had fallen afoul of the dying king's increasingly irrational suspicions, often facing brutal ends on the flimsiest of evidence. The political landscape of England was profoundly shaped by Henry's failing health, his pain, and his fear. Decisions that might have been handled with diplomacy and negotiation in his younger, more vibrant years were now resolved with blunt force, and the Axeman, dictated by the sudden violent whims of a monarch no longer fully anchored in reality. The king's physical state literally dictated the nation's policy, and a nation whose leader is driven by constant pain, deep-seated fear, and overwhelming paranoia is, inevitably, a nation prone to cruelty and terrifying unpredictability. Historians still debate whether his notorious Act of Succession, issued in 1543, which re-legitimized both Mary and Elizabeth, but placed them firmly behind Edward, was an act of genuine reconciliation or merely a desperate ultimate attempt to prevent any future challenges by tying all possible heirs, and even their potential children, to his own absolute will. It was a chilling testament to his continued, if failing, grip on power that he could command such an absolute decree, even from his sickbed, outlining the succession far beyond his immediate children. The constant gnawing fear of civil war, a fear deeply rooted in his own physical decline and the potential chaos it could unleash, was a pervasive undercurrent throughout his final decade, making every court decision a matter of life, death, and national destiny, all hanging by the thread of one man's decaying body. Henry VIII's end was not glorious. It was a prolonged, agonizing affair, managed with an almost surgical secrecy by his closest advisors. By late 1546, the king was barely recognizable, a grotesque shadow of his former vibrant self. His face was puffy, his body massively swollen, his leg ulcers so grievous that the stench of putrefaction was said to be unbearable, a pervasive, putrid odor that made everyone recoil from his presence. He was reportedly carried everywhere in a specially designed chair. His immense bulk and constant pain making him unable to walk even short distances. Imagine the most powerful man in England, reduced to this, a prisoner within his own failing biology. His voice, once booming and authoritative, was now a weak rasp, barely audible above the creaking of his chair. He barely ate, yet his body continued to swell, a phenomenon perhaps explained by congestive heart failure or severe dropsy, a truly grotesque sight of internal breakdown. The pain was constant, an agonizing, relentless torment, managed by increasing doses of opium that kept him in a semi-conscious haze for much of his final weeks. His powerful mind dulled. The once vibrant king was now a prisoner within his own decaying body, his grand dreams of immortality mocked by his own flesh. As death approached in January 1547, his advisors, led by Edward Seymour, soon to be Lord Protector for young Edward VI, meticulously controlled access to the king, essentially running the country from behind a curtain. This was a sophisticated political operation, not just sickbed care, ensuring minimal leaks. They knew that a power vacuum, even a temporary one, could lead to disaster. The palace became a hushed, anxious place, every whisper scrutinized. Henry himself seemed to delay acknowledging his impending death, perhaps clinging to the belief that his divine right made him immortal. It was only on his deathbed that he reportedly expressed regret for some of his more extreme actions, including the brutal dissolution of the monasteries, though even these confessions were likely muted by pain and opium. On January 28, 1547, in the early hours of the morning, Henry VIII finally succumbed, aged 55, his body ravaged by a lifetime of excess and pain. His death was kept secret for 2 days, allowing his council to consolidate power and manage the transition to his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, without immediate challenge. For 2 agonizing days, the king's corpse lay in state, a chilling secret shared by only a handful of men, a pure political necessity to secure allegiance. The silence of those 2 days was deafening, a stark testament to the fear and uncertainty that still surrounded the deceased monarch, even in death. Immediately after his death, the careful construction of his legacy began. The grotesque, tyrannical old man, ravaged by disease and paranoia, was quickly airbrushed from public memory, replaced by the myth of the strong, decisive king. Courtiers and chroniclers, eager to curry favor with the new regime, emphasized his achievements. The break with Rome, the establishment of the Church of England, and ruthlessly downplayed his cruelty. The imposing image of the powerful, commanding monarch, forever captured in Holbein's iconic portraits, was etched into history, largely overshadowing the festering reality of his agonizing decay. His body, already an ordeal to manage in life, continued to be so in death. Even the funeral procession was reportedly a challenge due to his immense weight and the putrefaction. Stories, possibly apocryphal but so potent in their imagery, persist of his coffin bursting open due to the gases of decomposition, his massive, putrefying remains spilling out, a final horrifying act of rebellion from a body that had tormented him for so long, mirroring his psychological unraveling. Whether true or not, such tales powerfully highlight the pervasive public understanding of his grotesque physical state and the visceral revulsion it inspired. The man who had been the most powerful ruler in England for almost 40 years left behind a legacy of both revolution and ruin, and a physical end that was anything but regal. The myth-making was swift and comprehensive, creating a historical narrative that has endured for centuries. obscuring the festering reality of the king's final, painful years. So, what does this agonizing, secretive death tell us about Henry VIII and the England he left behind? It's a stark reminder that absolute power, even in the hands of a king, cannot conquer the inevitable decay of the human body. The physical corruption that plagued Henry's final years directly shaped the political and social landscape of England, leaving a legacy of both progress and profound trauma. The volatility of his late reign, driven by his pain and paranoia, led to rapid shifts in religious policy, a succession crisis that festered for decades, and a climate of fear that permeated every level of court life. The king's personal suffering was, in a very real sense, projected onto his kingdom. The violent swings from Catholicism to Protestantism, the brutal suppression of dissent, and the constant threat of execution were all amplified by a ruler who was literally coming undone from the inside out. The scramble for power among his advisors, as his health declined, ensured a turbulent succession, paving the way for the brief, radical reign of Edward VI, followed by the bloody Catholic restoration under Mary I, and finally, the golden age of Elizabeth I. Each of these reigns, with their own challenges and triumphs, was fundamentally shaped by the chaos and uncertainty sown by the dying Henry VIII. His insistence on a male heir, the very obsession that drove his marital decisions, ultimately led to the ascension of two powerful queens. The irony is palpable. The king who broke England for a son ended up cementing the power of his daughters, forcing a nation to come to terms with female rule against his deepest desires. Furthermore, the sheer administrative effort required to manage his physical decline, the constant medical attention, the discreet arrangements, the careful handling of his explosive temper, reveals a court that was not just serving a king, but managing a monumental and dangerous health crisis. This bureaucratic apparatus of management around his illness was a system in itself, mirroring the elaborate systems he created to control his kingdom. The making of a myth began even before his last breath. Those who followed him understood the danger of a weakened, decaying king being the lasting image of the monarchy. They carefully crafted a narrative of strength and divine right, ensuring that the Henry VIII history remembers is the formidable figure of Holbein's portraits, not the pus-ridden, swollen tyrant who terrified his own court in his final years. This wasn't just historical spin. It was essential for the stability of the Tudor dynasty. His death, therefore, was not merely the end of a long reign, but a pivotal moment that underscored the fragility of power and the inescapable reality of human decay. It laid bare the truth that even the most absolute monarch is ultimately subject to the whims of their own biology. And in doing so, it forced England to adapt, to evolve, and ultimately, to define itself beyond the shadow of one immensely powerful, profoundly broken man. So, centuries later, why does the gruesome reality of Henry VIII's death still matter? It's more than just morbid fascination. It's a critical lens through which we can understand the insidious nature of unchecked power, the profound impact of chronic suffering on decision-making, and how historical narratives are often carefully sculpted to serve political ends. First, consider the direct link between physical pain and tyranny. Henry's increasing cruelty and paranoia weren't random acts of a madman. They were, in large part, the psychologically devastating consequences of relentless agony and likely undiagnosed mental health issues exacerbated by his absolute authority. Imagine trying to run a kingdom, make life or death decisions for an entire nation, while every waking moment is a battle against searing pain from an ulcerated leg that never healed, or the debilitating throbs of chronic gout and possibly even syphilis. This wasn't just a physical inconvenience. It seeped into his very soul, twisting his temperament, fueling his explosive rage, and making him dangerously unpredictable. His advisors had to navigate not just political rivals, but the king's own unbearable suffering, often at great personal risk. This offers a chilling insight into how the suffering of leaders can translate, quite literally, into the suffering of nations, as his personal torment directly fueled the brutal shifts in policy that defined his later reign. Second, the meticulous cover-up and myth-making around his death reminds us of the constant battle between historical truth and convenient narrative. The history books want you to remember the strong, decisive king, the formidable figure of Holbein's portraits, not the incontinent, swollen figure who died in a stench of decay, riddled with disease and consumed by his own physical collapse. This deliberate sanitization wasn't just about protecting a sensitive legacy. It was essential for the stability of the Tudor dynasty. Successive monarchs, particularly his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, needed a powerful, almost godlike ancestor to legitimize their own rule, not a horrifying example of royal decay. Official chronicles and court-sanctioned historians actively propagated this myth, carefully curating every detail of his final years to present an image of a king who, though mortal, remained majestic even unto his dying breath. This highlights how powerful institutions and individuals will always try to control the story, especially when the truth is ugly and potentially destabilizing. His physical demise also forced a profound reckoning for the English monarchy. The lessons learned from managing a king who was both physically and mentally unraveling undoubtedly influenced how future monarchs would be advised and, crucially, how their own succession plans were handled. The chaos of Henry's final years, the fear that gripped the court, and the near anarchy of his advisors scrambling for power provided a brutal education in the limits of royal power. It pushed the young Edward VI into a whirlwind of radical religious reform, directly caused the bloody instability of Mary I's reign, and ultimately primed the nation for the strong, steady hand of Elizabeth I, whose own carefully managed image and succession planning were a direct counterpoint to her father's chaotic end. The indelible mark of Henry's slow, agonizing decay was left on the very foundation of the English crown, shaping its protocols and protections for centuries to come. Moreover, the cultural impact of his story continues to resonate. From plays and novels to TV shows like The Tudors and films, Henry VIII remains a figure of endless fascination. Yet many of these portrayals still lean heavily into the myth, presenting a man of vigor and intellect throughout his life, glossing over or entirely omitting the tragic, terrifying, and physically repulsive figure he became in his final years. We prefer the image of the robust monarch, the larger-than-life character, because confronting the complete, brutal picture of his decline, the oozing leg, the physical bulk, the paranoia, the rages born of pain, is simply too uncomfortable, too much of a challenge to the romanticized notion of absolute power. But to truly understand him, and the era he dominated, is to confront that complete, brutal truth. This isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint for understanding how systems of power can be corrupted from within, how personal suffering can metastasize into national trauma, and how the truth can be buried beneath layers of carefully constructed legend. It's a stark reminder that even the most absolute monarch is ultimately subject to the whims of their own biology, and that physical decay can lead to moral and political corruption that ripples through generations. The tale of Henry VIII's death challenges us to look beyond the glittering crowns and grand pronouncements, and to seek out the uncomfortable, festering truths that truly shape human events. Because when we understand the full, gruesome reality of history, we're better equipped to question the narratives presented to us today. We learn that power, decay, and myth are inextricably linked, and that the most dangerous lies are often the ones we're told are too sacred to question. The stench of Henry VIII's death may have faded, but its lessons remain, as pungent and powerful as ever. If this deep dive into the true agonizing end of Henry VIII left you rethinking everything you thought you knew, hit that like button, subscribe for more unvarnished historical truths, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next expose. And tell me in the comments below, what aspect of Henry's decay surprised or disturbed you the most? Your engagement helps us keep these forgotten stories alive. We began with the image of a formidable king, but what we've uncovered is a far more disturbing reality. Henry VIII's death was not just the end of a reign. It was the culmination of a decade of physical and mental decay, a testament to the corrosive power of chronic illness, and a masterclass in the creation of historical myth. The Golden Prince became a bloated, festering tyrant, his body and mind unraveling. Yet his powerful image was meticulously preserved to secure his legacy. This isn't merely a tale of royal suffering. It's a chilling reminder that absolute power, when combined with unchecked physical and psychological decline, can warp a nation's destiny. The sanitized history we often receive conceals uncomfortable truths, burying the gruesome realities beneath layers of comforting legend. Stay curious, stay critical, and never stop questioning the narratives presented by those in power. Because the most dangerous truths are often the ones they tried hardest to bury.